This video will be a brief overview on topics like manifest destiny and the acquisition of land in the Western territories, which will lead to increased sectional tensions between North and South over the course of the 1850s, culminating in South Carolina claiming to have seceded from the Union and the onset of the American Civil War. So this painting here, it's by a guy named John Gast. It is not completed until 1872, but it really symbolizes or showcases the predominant ideas of many Americans during the 1840s and 1850s. The idea of manifest destiny, that it's God's will that the United States moves across the continent and brings with it its specific institutions and democracy. And the idea of progress. So here is Columbia symbolizing the United States, and she's bringing along with her, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but a telegraph wire. You have trains coming, the so-called hardy pioneers chasing away the Indians, and the darkness, so light going into darkness. Now, again, manifest destiny, the idea that God is on America's side, and it is God's will that the United States conquer the North American continent. And part of this also was a population outlet by the 1840s as more and more immigrants are arriving on America's shores. Now, not all Americans believed in manifest destiny, but it was a reigning ideology and a guiding ideology for both policymakers and lay citizens. Now, it's going to lead us into a war with Mexico in 1846, and that will last until 1848. And the key thing here at the end of the war was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And some Americans were worried about expanding territory in the West, and they believed that it would be give more power to the slaveholding states and take power away from especially the Northeast. Now, the treaty, however, leads to the acquirement of over 500,000 square miles, which is known as the Mexican Cession, the area of what becomes New Mexico and California, for $15 million. And it sets the Rio Grande as the border of Texas. That had been the dispute that led to the Mexican-American War to begin with. And the U.S. is going to claim or assume all claims against Mexicans residing within the area and grant those resident Mexicans as U.S. citizens, whether they wanted to or not. Now, this is going to, again, kick off some tensions, escalating tensions between North and South over slavery. You can see the sort of orangish color here are the states that allowed slavery, while the free states have the greenish color, and all the unorganized territory here is left over from the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Now, the Mexican Cession had just given us all this land. It secured our right to Texas, as well as what is now the southwestern United States. So the question becomes, what happens to this territory? Will it be for slavery, or will it be for free labor? Even before the war ended, you had debates arising in Congress over any lands that may be acquired from Mexico. And in 1846, David Wilmot, a representative from Pennsylvania, submits what's become known as the Wilmot Proviso, which said any lands that we acquire from Mexico, at this point they didn't know, how large of a swath of land that would be, but any lands we may acquire would not be open to slavery. And Wilmot was not an abolitionist. He's somebody who believed in racial equality. He wanted to secure these lands for free labor. That is, laborers that could contract on their own, that made wages or owned their own land, not for enslaved labor. Now, this was a strict sectional vote along geographic lines. So Southerners voting with Southerners, Northerners voting with Northerners. And you see those tensions within the national political parties at this time, like the Whigs and the Democrats, which make up that two-party system in the late 1840s. It's also going to give rise to what's known as the Free Soil movement. In 1848, the Free Soil Party will run Martin Van Buren as president, and their platform was just this: to not allow slavery into Western territories held by the federal government. Now, very quickly, California is going to fill up with American settlers and citizens, because not long after the treaty is negotiated in 1848, gold is found in California outside of what is now San Francisco. And so thousands of people are flocking to this area. And once their population numbers rose, then they had the ability to apply for statehood, write a state constitution, and things like that. But the question was, is California, this what is going to become a very large state. Is it going to allow slavery or not? And of course, Southerners wanted to allow slavery to increase their power in the federal government, and Northerners want to block that by and large. Henry Clay, in one of his last great acts as an American statesman, will help broker what becomes known as the Compromise of 1850. And here he is presenting it on the floor of the Senate. Now, the Compromise of 1850 does a number of things. First, it allows California to enter the Union as a free state. The rest of the Mexican cession has really no reference to slavery, but it's going to fall under what's known as popular sovereignty. That is, the people that reside there are going to vote whether or not to allow slavery. It also prohibits the slave trade, the selling and buying of enslaved peoples in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C., but it will not ban slavery from that area, from that city. It also strengthens the fugitive slave law, and it's actually going to, for a time, mitigate some tensions between North and South. You had some more radical Southerners who were calling for secession ahead of the Compromise of 1850. Some historians go so far as to say this was really the appeasement of 1850, once again giving Southern slaveholders what they want as they threaten to destroy the Union. Now, this Fugitive Slave Act, there had been one on the books, but again, this 1850 version strengthened that act. And so this allowed slave catchers to enter northern states and presumably going after runaway slaves and taking them back to bondage. They denied these people the right to jury. They had no right to testify. There was really no safeguards against false identification. If you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, it's about Solomon Northup, a free Black man in the North who is kidnapped and sold into slavery. It's going to implicate all Northerners, which, many Northerners were against slavery. Many were not. Some were neutral. They didn't really give it more than a thought. But here now, Northerners are responsible to turning over suspected runaway slaves to local authorities to be shipped back south, and it's also retroactive. So the slaves that had escaped Southern bondage and made it to the northern states and begun a new life now could be hunted down and kidnapped and sold back into slavery. So here's just a reminder of where we are geographically as the Compromise of 1850 goes into effect. California, the free state, blue states are our slave states, and green is free states and or territories. Now, in 1854, you've got this question of what is going to happen with the Kansas Territory, which, going back to 1820, resided above the 3630 line, which forbade slavery north of that line within the area of the Louisiana Purchase. But the Kansas Territory is at the point where it has a large enough population to write a state constitution and petition for statehood. And Southerners now look at the Missouri Compromise as hindering their growth, their expansion of slavery. So they protest against the at this point had been reigning law for over 30 years. And with the help of a Democratic senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas, they get rid of the Missouri Compromise altogether, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the law that does that revokes the Missouri Compromise. What it did is it allowed for this idea of popular sovereignty to take hold, that the residents of the Kansas Territory would vote themselves whether or not that territory would become a slave state or a free state. Now, what that led to was pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces heading to Kansas to influence the vote. So Massachusetts forms an immigration society trying to acquire people who have anti-slavery tendencies to go to Kansas to vote for that to become a free state. Meanwhile, pro-slavery forces are doing the same things. The votes that are being held in Kansas are incredibly corrupt. They're sending, Missouri sending over what's known as border ruffians, guys to go intimidate voters and to vote illegally in these elections to try to sway the territory to become a slave state. Now, what emerges out of this chaos is really a prelude to the American Civil War, which will break out in 1861. And this is Americans fighting Americans over the issue of slavery. You actually have two rival governments that will form in Kansas, both claiming to be the legitimate government. Lecompton was a pro-slavery government, and Topeka was an anti-slavery government. There was a cycle of retaliation, of fighting between pro and anti-slavery settlers, and over 52 are killed in 1854 and 55, and that violence will just escalate in the following year of 1856. So Americans are watching this with real concern. Again, these are Americans killing other Americans over this divisive issue of the future of slavery in the Western territories and really the United States as a whole. Back in Washington, D.C., in May of 1856, Charles Sumner, on your left, was a senator from Massachusetts and a pretty vocal abolitionist. And he had given a speech denouncing slavery and criticizing slaveholders on the floor of the Senate. And a couple days later, a young slaveholder congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks entered the chamber as Charles Sumner sat at his desk and worked, and beat him nearly to death with a cane. And so you can see the violence has now entered into the halls of government, into the United States Senate. Now, Northerners, of course, were outraged by this. Here's a political cartoon that so-called Southern chivalry was actually just beating arguments down with violence or with a club rather than using, logic and debating tactics. Now, just a couple of days later, John Brown is a fairly radical abolitionist who, along with several of his sons, had migrated to the Kansas territory to take part in this bleeding Kansas, to try to sway Kansas territory to become a free state and to battle anti-slavery, to battle pro-slavery settlers. Now, he hears the news about Charles Sumner being beaten on the floor of the Senate, and he loses it, and he goes with at least one of his sons and some other anti-slavery settlers to a grouping of pro-slavery houses along Pottawatomie Creek on May 24th, 1856. It's the middle of the night. They drag these men out of their homes and murder them in front of their families. So they kill 5 pro-slavery settlers. This, of course, is national news. John Brown becomes a name overnight, known by pretty much all Americans, and it is going to further increase that divide between North and South. You have a presidential election in 1856 amidst the violence in Kansas and the violence on the floor of the Senate. The Republicans, a new political party which emerged in 1854, they run their first national candidate. Their platform is that they're against the expansion of slavery. They're not advocating abolition of slavery where it already existed. The Democrats will run James Buchanan. He will put forth a platform of popular sovereignty, that is, that the residents in the Western territories will decide themselves. And then you have a third party known as the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, which ran Millard Fillmore. And this was a party that was really anti-Catholic and anti-foreigners, again, within the context of an increased immigration, especially from places like Ireland. Now, the Whig Party had really fallen apart over the Kansas-Nebraska issue. Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs went their separate ways. Many Whigs gravitated towards the Republican Party in the North, at least, and Southern Whigs were sort of, without a party. Some of them would go on to support the Democratic Party. Now, Buchanan's going to win. You can see this is completely a sectional election in that all of the South goes with Buchanan, and the only votes that Fremont of this new Republican Party will acquire are in the North. Now, as President James Buchanan is getting ready to take office in early March of 1857, the Supreme Court is also getting ready to put forth its decision in what's known as Dred Scott v. Sanford. Now, Scott had been enslaved in Missouri, and his owner had taken him to the Free Territory of Wisconsin. And in the 1840s, Scott would then, when he returned with his master to Missouri, would sue for his freedom, claiming that he had been moved to free territory and therefore he was free. This would work its way through the local and the state courts and eventually to the United States Supreme Court, where the Chief Justice Roger Taney, a former slaveholder from Maryland, gave the decision. And the decision is considered by historians to be, a travesty of justice, of course, also just an illogical decision overall. He starts off by saying that no Black person, free or enslaved, are citizens of the United States. Therefore, Dred Scott can't bring a suit. So if that's the case, that's where he should have stopped. But instead, he goes on to say that the Missouri Compromise, which had been off the books since 1854, violated the Constitution. He claims that popular sovereignty, this idea that was put forth by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, also probably violated the Constitution, in that Congress has to protect slave property. They have to protect the right of an individual to take all of their property, even if that is property in human flesh, into any state or territory under the federal government, or under control of the federal government, because the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution prohibits the government from depriving a citizen of their property. So in effect, this decision would have opened all those territories to slavery. As you can imagine, abolitionists were enraged. It appeared to many in the North that the Supreme Court was in cahoots with Southern slave interests and holding or doing their bidding, rather. Sounds familiar, right? Now, the South wants a stronger federal slave code coming out of this. That is a federal law dealing with the rights of slaveholders and the lack of rights for enslaved peoples. Now re-enter John Brown in late 1859, 3 years after that massacre at Pottawatomie Creek, in which he killed 5 pro-slavery settlers. He had actually been touring the North, raising money for abolitionist causes and secretly raising money amongst wealthy abolitionists for a strike against the South, an invasion of the South that he would lead, that would hopefully, in his mind, cause a guerrilla warfare in the South and eventually the end of slavery. And that's all going to start at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in which the plan was him and his men were going to attack a federal armory, acquire as much weapons as they could, and then move into, head south through the Appalachian Mountains, attacking plantations and freeing slaves and arming those slaves, and eventually continuing to move south and causing a full-scale war that would lead to the end of slavery. Now, it doesn't happen for sort of unknown reasons. Brown delays after entering the armory, and he never makes it out. And he is arrested, actually, by Robert E. Lee, and he's going to be put in jail in Virginia for several months. And the time leading up to his execution, he grants interviews to newspapers. He's talking, he's corresponding with different people in the North. And he's going to be executed for treason and sedition by the state of Virginia. And notice the date here, December 2nd, 1859, and we are entering into an election year. Now, John Brown does a lot to radicalize the South against the North, because by 1859, it appears that if you're a Southern slaveholder, that all of the North are becoming radical abolitionists. They are all John Browns in training. Now, meanwhile, for the North, they are increasingly, because of things like Dred Scott, because of Preston Brooks beating Charles Sumner, they are seeing Southerners as these brutal slave masters that are trying to further expand their influence in the federal government. All this is, of course, taking place within the context of an upcoming political contest in 1860. The Democratic Party is going to break apart along North and South lines, and Southern Democrats will leave the convention in Chicago in 1860 and nominate their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. Northern Democrats are going to coalesce around Stephen Douglas, the Illinois senator that had been so important to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And then there'll be a third party, the Constitutional Union Party. This was, sort of really had its popularity in the upper South states of places like Tennessee or North Carolina, and this was a compromise party that witnessed or were seeing the dismantling or the breaking apart of the political union between North and South, and they hope to save that. Now, the Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln. He is a relatively unknown politician out of Illinois. He had spent some time in the House of Representatives, had ran for the Senate in 1858 against Stephen Douglas and lost. But he was a well-known name amongst Northern Republicans, and he was nominated for the party's ticket because he was a conservative, in the sense that he was not a rabid abolitionist. He stuck with the party platform, which was that we will not allow slavery to extend to the territories, but we won't touch it where it is. We will not move against slavery in the South. The Republicans denounced John Brown's raid from the previous year, and they put forth an economic plan of using the federal government to promote Western expansion by giving settlers free land, by building transportation networks, and by protecting American industries through the tariff. Now, Lincoln's not even on the ballots in the southern states, yet he's still going to carry the election because the Democratic Party being divided between North and South, and those votes that are taken away by the Constitutional Union Party, and the North just has a larger population than the South. So you can see once again that this is an election that comes down to North and South. Lincoln's going to take the North as well as those new states of California and Oregon, while the Deep South especially will go towards the Southern Democrat nominee Breckinridge. Now, immediately after the election, South Carolina, within just a few weeks, are going to hold a secession convention where they're going to vote to leave the Union. So for a brief time in late 1860 and early 1861, South Carolina is out on its own, claiming at this point to be an independent republic within the continental United States. And they will send out commissioners, messengers to go to other state houses to plead with places like Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee or all these other slaveholding states to join them in a nation of slave states, what will become known as the Confederacy, a nation that will uphold slavery and states' rights as they saw them. So by December of 1860, you have this breaking apart of the Union, a process that will quicken in the opening months of 1861 and ultimately culminate in April of 1861 with Southern forces bombarding Union troops within Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina, and the Civil War was upon us.